They laughed at the crippled orphan begging for work, until he pulled out the mayor's will and said, "He promised me everything." The boy's left leg had been twisted since birth, bent like a tree branch that grew wrong in the wind. It dragged behind him as he walked, scraping against the wooden boards of Copper Ridge's main street, leaving a trail in the dust that marked his passing like a snake's belly through sand. His name was Samuel, though most folks just called him the cripple or that broken thing, and he had learned to answer to both. On this particular morning, the sun hung low and angry over the town, casting long shadows that made everything look older than it was. Samuel pulled himself along the boardwalk, his good leg doing most of the work while his twisted one followed like a reluctant dog. His shirt was too big for his thin frame, handed down from some charitable soul who probably felt better about themselves after giving it away. The fabric hung loose around his shoulders, making him look even smaller than his 15 years. He stopped at Miller's General Store first, pressing his face against the window until his breath fogged the glass. Inside, he could see Mrs. Miller counting coins behind the counter, her fingers moving quick and sure through the silver pieces. Samuel knocked on the doorframe, a soft sound that barely carried over the morning wind. "Mrs. Miller," he called, his voice cracking the way boys' voices do when they're caught between child and man. "I can sweep your floors. I can stack boxes. I don't eat much." She looked up from her counting, and her face changed the way faces do when they see something they don't want to deal with. "We don't need help, Samuel. Try somewhere else." But there was nowhere else to try. He had been to every business in Copper Ridge, knocked on every door, offered his services to every soul who would listen. The answer was always the same. No one wanted a boy whose leg didn't work right, whose body was built wrong, whose very presence reminded them that sometimes God made mistakes. Samuel dragged himself to the next storefront, and the next, leaving his snake trail in the dust. At the blacksmith shop, Mr. Henderson actually laughed when Samuel asked for work. "What would you do, boy? Hold the anvil steady with that twisted stick of yours." Henderson's voice carried across the street, and other folks stopped to listen. "Maybe you could be our good luck charm. They say cripples bring fortune, though I can't see how." The laughter followed Samuel down the street like hungry dogs. It echoed off the buildings, bounced between the wooden walls, and settled into his chest where it would stay forever. He had learned that laughter was worse than silence, worse than being ignored. At least silence was honest. By noon, the sun was high and mean, and Samuel's throat was dry as old leather. He sat in the shade behind the church, his back against the cool stone wall, and pulled out the piece of paper he always carried in his shirt pocket. It was wrinkled and soft from handling, the edges worn smooth by his fingers. The writing was faded but still clear enough to read, and Samuel read it every day like a prayer. The paper said he belonged to someone. It said he mattered. Mayor Harrison had been the richest man in Copper Ridge, owner of the largest ranch and most of the businesses that kept the town alive. He was a big man with silver hair and hands that looked like they could break rocks, but Samuel had only seen him from a distance. Men like the mayor didn't notice boys like Samuel. But the mayor had died 3 days ago, and the whole town was gathering at the church for his funeral. Samuel watched from his spot in the shadows as people filed past in their best clothes, their faces serious and respectful. These are the same people who laughed at him in the street, but now they walked quiet and slow, thinking about death and money and what comes after. The service lasted an hour, filled with words about Mayor Harrison's generosity and vision. Samuel listened through the thin church walls as the preacher talked about how the mayor had built Copper Ridge from nothing, how he had given jobs and hope to anyone willing to work hard. The boy wondered if the mayor had ever noticed him begging for those same jobs. After the funeral, people gathered in the churchyard for the reading of the will. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, though they tried to hide their eagerness behind sad faces. Mayor Harrison had no children, no wife, no close family that anyone knew about. His fortune would have to go somewhere. Mr. Crawford, the town lawyer, stood on the church steps with a thick envelope in his hands. He cleared his throat and began to read in a voice that carried over the crowd like distant thunder. "To the people of Copper Ridge, who have been my neighbors and friends, I leave my thanks and my hope for your continued prosperity." The crowd murmured, waiting for the real news. "To my foreman, Jack Murphy, I leave my horse and saddle and $500 in gold." More murmuring, louder now. "To Mrs. Patterson, who kept my house and cooked my meals, I leave $1,000 and the furniture from the parlor." People were shifting now, whispering to each other, calculating what might be left. "And to the rest of my estate, including my ranch, my business interests, and all remaining assets, I leave everything to Samuel Hartley, the boy with the twisted leg who has shown more courage in his 15 years than most men show in a lifetime." The silence that followed was complete. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. Samuel felt the world shift around him like sand sliding down a hill. People were turning to look at him, their faces moving through shock and confusion towards something that might have been anger. He pulled himself to his feet, his twisted leg shaking with the effort. "That can't be right," someone called out. The mayor didn't even know that boy. Mr. Crawford looked up from the will, his own face pale with surprise. "The document is legal and properly witnessed. Samuel Hartley is the sole inheritor of the Harrison estate." Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out his worn piece of paper. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely unfold it, but he managed to smooth it out enough to read. His voice came out small at first, then stronger. "He didn't know me," Samuel said, and now the crowd could hear him. "He left me this note 2 years ago when I was sleeping behind his store. It says he was watching me. It says he knew I was strong, even if my leg wasn't. It says someday I'd understand why God made me different." He held up the paper, and people pressed closer to see. The words were simple, written in the mayor's careful handwriting. "Boy, you have something most folks don't. You keep going when others would quit. Remember that. It matters more than you know. E. Harrison." The crowd was silent again, but this silence was different. It was the quiet that comes after thunder, when the world is waiting to see what the lightning has burned down. Samuel looked at their faces and saw his whole life reflected back at him. The laughter, the rejection, the casual cruelty of people who had decided he was worth nothing. But now he was worth everything, and the weight of that truth settled on his shoulders like winter snow, cold and heavy and impossible to shake off. The Harrison house sat on the hill like a castle built of dark wood and broken dreams. Samuel had never been inside before, had only looked up at its windows from the street below and wondered what kind of man lived in such a place. Now the brass key felt heavy in his palm as he stood before the front door, its carved surface smooth and foreign under his fingertips. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, had left that morning after packing her things in silence. She hadn't looked at Samuel when she handed him the keys, hadn't said goodbye or wished him luck. Just set the brass ring on the kitchen table and walked out like she was leaving behind something that had gone sour. Samuel understood. He was used to people walking away. The door opened with a sound like a sigh, and Samuel stepped into a world he had never imagined. The hallway stretched before him, wider than most people's entire homes, with a staircase that curved up into shadows. Paintings hung on the walls, faces of people he didn't know, their eyes following him as he dragged his twisted leg across the polished wood floor. Everything was too big, too clean, too quiet. His footsteps echoed in the emptiness, each sound multiplied and thrown back at him from corners he couldn't see. Samuel had spent his life in small spaces, sleeping behind buildings or in the corner of the church when the preacher took pity on him. This house felt like a mouth that might swallow him whole. The kitchen was larger than Miller's General Store, with a wood stove that could have cooked for 20 people and windows that looked out over the town below. Samuel could see folks moving through the streets like ants, going about their business, probably talking about him. Word traveled fast in Copper Ridge, and by now everyone would know that the crippled beggar boy was living in the mayor's house. He climbed the stairs slowly, his good leg taking most of his weight while his twisted one bumped against each step. The second floor held bedrooms and a study filled with books Samuel couldn't read, their leather spines dark and serious. But it was the narrow staircase at the end of the hall that caught his attention, the one that led up into the attic. The steps were dusty and creaked under his weight, but they held. At the top, Samuel found a door that was different from all the others. This one was plain wood, unmarked like it was trying not to be noticed. When he pushed it open, he understood why. The room was small and cramped, nothing like the grand spaces below. But it was filled with things that made Samuel's chest tight with recognition. There were newspapers scattered on a small desk, old issues with dates going back years. And on every page, someone had circled articles about accidents, about children hurt or lost, about families torn apart by fire and sickness and bad luck. Samuel moved closer, his twisted leg dragging across the floorboards. One newspaper was folded to a story about a house fire on the edge of town. The headline read, "Family perishes in blaze, only child survives." The date was 15 years old, and someone had drawn a careful circle around the entire article in red ink. His hand was shaking as he read. The Hartley family had died in the fire. Mother, father, 2 older brothers. Only a baby had lived, pulled from the flames by a neighbor who heard crying in the smoke. The baby's leg had been crushed by a falling beam, twisted and broken, but he had survived when no one else did. Samuel's name was in the newspaper. Samuel Hartley, age 6 months, the only survivor. There were more papers, more articles. Stories about the boy who lived behind buildings and begged for work. Stories about how the town dealt with orphans, how they were passed from family to family until no one wanted them anymore. Someone had been collecting these stories, keeping track of Samuel's life like he was something important. In the corner of the room sat a wooden box, old and scratched, but carefully maintained. Samuel lifted the lid with trembling fingers and found photographs inside. Pictures of a family he didn't remember, faces that looked almost familiar in the way dreams do when you're waking up. A woman with kind eyes, a man with strong hands, 2 boys who might have been his brothers, smiling at something outside the camera's view. At the bottom of the box was a letter, written in the same careful handwriting he remembered from the mayor's note. It was addressed to Samuel, dated just a month before Mayor Harrison died. "Boy," it began, and Samuel could hear the mayor's voice in the words. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and you'll be wondering why a stranger left you everything he had. The truth is, you weren't a stranger. I was the neighbor who pulled you from that fire 15 years ago. I was the one who broke your leg getting you out, and I've been watching over you ever since, making sure you had food when you needed it, making sure you stayed alive even when the world seemed set against you." Samuel's breath came short and quick. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in like the memory of smoke and flames. "I never spoke to you because I was afraid," the letter continued. "Afraid you'd blame me for not saving the others. Afraid you'd hate me for the leg I broke trying to save your life. But I watched you grow up, watched you keep going when other boys would have given up. You have something most folks don't, something that can't be broken no matter how twisted your body gets. You have the will to survive, to keep walking even when every step hurts." The letter was longer, filled with apologies and explanations, but Samuel couldn't read anymore. He set it down and looked around the room with new eyes. This wasn't just a collection of newspaper articles. It was a shrine to his life, built by a man who had saved him once and spent 15 years trying to save him again. Below, he could hear voices in the yard. People were gathering outside the house, their conversations drifting up through the windows. Samuel went to the small attic window and looked down at the crowd that had formed on his front lawn. They had come to pay their respects, they said, to offer their help and friendship. Mrs. Miller was there with a pie, the same woman who had turned him away from her store that morning. Mr. Henderson stood beside her, hat in hand, talking about how he'd always known Samuel was special. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by smiles that looked painted on. Samuel watched them for a long time, these people who had ignored him when he was nothing and now crowded his yard when he was everything. Their faces were turned up toward his windows, hopeful and eager, like flowers following the sun. But Samuel remembered their laughter, remembered the way they had looked through him like he wasn't there. The mayor had saved his life once, But now Samuel wondered if he had saved him only to learn a harder truth about the world and the people in it. Samuel spent 3 weeks learning to be rich, and it was harder than learning to be poor had ever been. The mayor's desk was covered with papers that meant things he didn't understand at first. Deeds and contracts, loan agreements and mortgage notes. But Mr. Crawford, the lawyer, came by every day to explain how money worked when you had enough of it to matter. "You own Henderson's blacksmith shop," Crawford said, pointing to a document with careful writing. "He's behind on his payments. 2 months now." Samuel remembered Henderson's laughter, the way the man's voice had carried across the street when he called Samuel worthless. Now Henderson owed him money, and Samuel held the paper that could take away everything the blacksmith had worked for. "What happens if he doesn't pay?" Samuel asked. "You take the shop. It's yours by law." The power felt strange in Samuel's hands, like holding fire without getting burned. All those years of begging for work, of being turned away and laughed at, and now he owned the very places that had rejected him. The irony tasted like metal in his mouth. Henderson was the first to come knocking. Samuel was sitting in the mayor's old chair, trying to read a book about cattle prices, when he heard the heavy boots on the front porch. The blacksmith stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking smaller than Samuel remembered. "Samuel," Henderson said, and his voice was different now, softer, with none of the mockery Samuel remembered. "I heard you wanted to see me." Samuel hadn't sent for him, but he didn't correct the lie. He just looked at Henderson and waited the way he had learned to wait for scraps of food or kindness. "About the shop payments," Henderson continued. "I know I'm behind, but business has been slow. The drought killed most of the cattle drives, and folks aren't shoeing as many horses. I can get you something by next month, I promise." Samuel remembered sleeping behind Henderson's shop on cold nights, how the warm air from the forge had kept him from freezing. He remembered asking for work, any work, even just sweeping up the metal shavings. Henderson had laughed then, made jokes about cripples bringing bad luck. "You told me I was worthless," Samuel said quietly. Henderson's face went red, then pale. I was wrong, Samuel. I see that now. You're a fine young man, and I should have given you a chance. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." Samuel looked at the papers on his desk, at Henderson's signature on the loan agreement. The blacksmith owed $600, more money than he could probably earn in 2 years of good business. Samuel could take the shop today if he wanted. He could watch Henderson pack his tools and leave town with nothing. "I'll give you 1 more month," Samuel said finally. "But if you can't pay by then, the shop becomes mine." Henderson nodded, so hard his whole body shook. "Thank you, Samuel. You're kinder than I deserve." After Henderson left, Samuel sat in the quiet house and wondered why kindness felt so much like cruelty. He had given the man another month, but they both knew Henderson couldn't pay. The drought would continue, the cattle drives wouldn't come, and in 30 days Samuel would own another piece of Copper Ridge. Mrs. Miller came next, then the owner of the hotel, then the man who ran the grain store. One by one, they all made the walk up the hill to Samuel's front door, all carrying debt papers and wearing the same desperate smile. They called him Mr. Hartley now, offered him their best merchandise at half price, invited him to dinner with their families. But Samuel remembered their faces from before, remembered being invisible to them when he had nothing to offer. Their kindness now felt hollow, like the sound his twisted leg made when it dragged across empty wooden floors. The town began to change around him. Shop owners waved when he walked down the street, their smiles bright and false as painted flowers. Children who used to throw rocks at him now scattered when they saw him coming. But it wasn't cruelty that moved them anymore. It was fear. He had become something they couldn't understand, a crippled boy who held their parents' futures in his damaged hands. Samuel found himself spending more time in the attic, reading through the mayor's letters and newspapers. There were more papers up there than he had first realized, hidden in boxes and tucked behind loose floorboards. Stories about other towns where the rich had squeezed the poor until everything crumbled. Letters from a mayor to distant friends, talking about the loneliness of holding other people's lives in your hands. One letter, written in the mayor's shaky handwriting near the end of his life, stopped Samuel cold. "I've lived 40 years in this town," it read, and I have no friends. Only people who need things from me, who smile because they have to, who measure every word against what I might give them or take away. A man can starve for honest conversation the same way he can starve for bread. Samuel understood, then, why the mayor had left him everything. Not as a gift, but as a test. Or maybe as a warning. The month passed like winter rain, slow and cold and inevitable. Henderson couldn't pay, just as Samuel had known he wouldn't. The blacksmith came to the house on the last day, his face gray with defeat. "I don't have the money," Henderson said simply. "I tried everything. Sold my horse, my tools, even my wife's wedding ring. It's not enough." Samuel looked at him across the mayor's big desk. This man who had laughed at a crippled boy begging for work. Now Henderson was the one begging, his eyes red with shame and sleepless nights. "The shop is mine then," Samuel said. "Yes. Pack your things. Be out by tomorrow." Henderson nodded and turned to go, his shoulders bent like he was carrying something too heavy to bear. At the door, he stopped and looked back. "Samuel," he said, "I know I got no right to ask this, but my boy, my youngest, he's sick. The doctor says he needs medicine from Santa Fe, expensive medicine. If you could just loan me." "No," Samuel said, and the word came out harder than he meant it to. Henderson's face crumpled, but he didn't argue. He just nodded and walked away, his boots echoing on the wooden porch until the sound faded into the wind. Samuel sat alone in the big house that night, listening to the silence that seemed to press against the walls from outside. He owned Henderson's shop now, and Miller's store, and half the buildings on Main Street. The people who had rejected him now depended on him for their survival. But as he lay in the mayor's bed, staring up at the ceiling where shadows moved like ghosts, Samuel wondered if winning had just been another way of losing everything that mattered. Winter came to Copper Ridge like a quiet thief, stealing the warmth from the air and painting frost on the windows of Samuel's big house. He had been living there for 3 months now, surrounded by furniture that belonged to a dead man and papers that made him richer every day. The townspeople still smiled when they saw him, but their eyes held something different now. Not just fear, but the kind of careful distance people keep from things that might bite. Samuel woke early on the morning that would change everything, pulled from sleep by a sound he couldn't quite place. The house was cold. The fire in his bedroom hearth burned down to gray ash and glowing embers. He pulled on his clothes and dragged his twisted leg to the window, looking out at a world turned white with the first snow of the season. At first, he thought the dark shape by his front gate was a pile of old rags blown there by the wind. But as he watched, the shape moved slightly, and Samuel realized it was a person. Someone was lying in the snow outside his house, not moving much, probably not moving enough to live much longer in the cold. Samuel grabbed his coat and made his way down the stairs, his twisted leg making the going slow and careful. By the time he reached the front door, his chest was tight with worry. People didn't just collapse outside other people's houses unless something was very wrong. The woman in the snow was old, older than anyone Samuel had ever seen close up. Her hair was white as the frost around her, and her clothes were thin and worn, not made for winter weather. She was breathing, but just barely, her lips blue with cold and her hands shaking like leaves in the wind. Samuel knelt beside her, ignoring the way the snow soaked through his pants and chilled his knees. He turned her face toward him, brushing away the ice crystals that had formed on her cheeks, and suddenly the years fell away like old paint peeling from a fence. Mrs. Chun, the Chinese woman who had run the small laundry behind Main Street until her husband died, and she couldn't keep up with the work anymore. Samuel remembered her not because she had been kind to everyone, but because she had been kind to him when no one else was. 5 years ago, when Samuel was 10 and living wherever he could find shelter, Mrs. Chun had left small bundles of food outside her laundry. Never much, just bread wrapped in clean cloth, sometimes an apple or a piece of dried meat. She never said the food was for him, never even looked at him directly when he came to collect it. But it appeared every few days like clockwork, always in the same spot, always when Samuel needed it most. Other folks had ignored Mrs. Chun, too, called her names Samuel didn't understand, made jokes about her strange cooking smells and the way she spoke English with careful, measured words. When her husband died, no one had offered to help her keep the laundry running. She had just disappeared one day, like people sometimes did when Copper Ridge decided it didn't want them anymore. Now she was dying in the snow outside Samuel's house, and he was the only one who could save her. Getting Mrs. Chun inside was harder than Samuel had expected. She was small but completely limp, and his twisted leg made it difficult to carry her weight. But he managed, dragging her up the front steps and into the warm hallway, leaving a trail of melting snow across the wooden floors. He put her in the spare bedroom downstairs, the one closest to the kitchen where he could keep a fire burning. Mrs. Chin's breathing was shallow and rough, like paper tearing slowly. Samuel covered her with every blanket he could find and built up the fire until the room was warm as summer. For 2 days, he tended to her like she had once tended to his hunger. He made soup from the vegetables in the cellar, thin broth that she could swallow when she was awake enough to drink. He changed her clothes, washing her old dress and finding one of the mayor's shirts that was clean and dry. He sat beside her bed and watched her breathe, afraid that if he looked away, she might stop. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Chin opened her eyes and looked at him with recognition. "Samuel," she said, her voice like wind through dry grass. "You grew up." "Yes, ma'am. You got tall. And you got a good house now." Samuel looked around the rich bedroom, at the heavy furniture and thick carpet. "It's not really mine," he said. "It belonged to Mayor Harrison." Mrs. Chin's eyes were sharp despite her weakness. "He left it to you, though. That makes it yours." "I guess so." "You guess." Mrs. Chun tried to sit up, and Samuel helped her lean against the pillows. "Boy, you either own something or you don't. Can't be halfway about property." Samuel was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the papers on the mayor's desk, all the people who owed him money they couldn't pay. "Sometimes I think owning things isn't the same as having them." Mrs. Chin studied his face. "You sound like an old man who's seen too much. But you're still just a boy." "I don't feel like a boy anymore." "What do you feel like?" Samuel considered the question. "Like I'm carrying something too heavy, but I can't put it down." Mrs. Chin nodded slowly. "Your mayor friend, he carries something heavy too. I've seen it in his face all those years. Man gets rich, man gets lonely. 2 sides of the same coin." That afternoon, while Mrs. Chun slept, Samuel went up to the attic one more time. He had read most of the mayor's letters by now, but there was one box he hadn't opened, pushed far back under the eaves where the ceiling was too low to stand. The box was sealed with wax and string, like it was meant to stay closed until the right time came. Inside, Samuel found one final letter, written in the mayor's handwriting, but dated only a week before he died. The envelope was addressed to Samuel when he understands the weight. Samuel's hands shook as he opened it. "Boy," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've learned what it means to hold other people's lives in your hands. You've felt the power that comes with money, and you've tasted the loneliness that comes with it too. I left you everything I had because I wanted to see what you would do with it. Not what you would buy, not what you would take, but what you would give away." Samuel read on, the mayor's words sinking into his chest like stones into deep water. "I have watched you for 15 years, Samuel. I watched you share food when you had almost nothing. I watched you help Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries when your leg was hurting. I watched you give your coat to that sick dog behind Miller's store, even though it was the only warm thing you owned. You have something most rich folks never learn, something I never learned until it was too late. You know that the best part of having anything is being able to give it away." The letter continued, but Samuel's eyes were too blurry to read clearly. He wiped them with his sleeve and tried again. "The inheritance was never about making you rich, Samuel. It was about giving you the chance to make other people's lives better. Every person in Copper Ridge who owes you money, everyone who treated you badly when you had nothing, they're all depending on you now. You can crush them if you want. Take their shops, their homes, their futures. You have that power, and maybe they deserve it." Samuel turned the page. "But I'm hoping you'll choose something harder. I'm hoping you'll forgive their debts, help their businesses, be the man this town needs instead of the one it deserves. Not because they've earned it, but because you're better than they are. because kindness is the only thing that makes power worth having. The letter ended with instructions about legal documents and bank accounts, ways Samuel could forgive the debts legally and help people start over. But Samuel barely read those parts. He was thinking about Mrs. Chun downstairs, about the bread she had left for a hungry boy who had nothing to offer in return. When he came back down to check on her, Mrs. Chun was sitting up in bed, looking stronger. She watched him enter the room, her eyes taking in his face like she was reading something written there. "You found something up in that attic," she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, something that changed how you see things. Samuel sat down in the chair beside her bed. "Mrs. Chun, why did you leave food for me all those years? You didn't know me. I couldn't pay you back." Mrs. Chun was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the snow that was still falling. Finally, she spoke. "My husband and me, we came here with nothing. No money, no friends, nobody who wanted us around. But there was one lady, Mrs. Rodriguez. She run the little store that used to be where Miller's is now. She gave us credit when we had no money, let us pay when we could. Never asked for nothing back, except that we do the same for somebody else someday." She turned to look at Samuel directly. "When I seen you sleeping behind buildings, hungry and cold, I remembered what it felt like to need help. And I remembered what Mrs. Rodriguez told me. She said kindness ain't something you do because people deserve it. It's something you do because you got the chance to do it." Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening in a room that had been locked for too long. All the anger he had been carrying, all the satisfaction he had taken in watching his former tormentors grovel, it felt suddenly heavy and useless, like carrying rocks when he could be carrying flowers instead. That evening, as Mrs. Chun slept and the snow continued to fall outside his windows, Samuel sat at the mayor's desk and began to write. Letters to Henderson and Mrs. Miller and all the others who owed him money they couldn't pay. Letters that said their debts were forgiven, that they could start over, that sometimes the best thing a person could do with power was to give it away. He wrote until his hand cramped and his twisted leg ached from sitting still so long. And when he was finished, he looked out at Copper Ridge sleeping under its blanket of snow and felt something he had never felt before. Not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet warmth that comes from choosing to be better than the world expects you to be.